Well, welcome, John. Thank you for coming tonight. Just before we start, I would like to say that this is hold it up the right way around. This is a wonderful book. It's a really, really detailed, informative, accessible, and important book. And I'm very, very pleased to have the opportunity to read it. Thank you. It's slightly unusual for a Christian scholar to write a book about a Muslim. It's certainly unusual for a biographer to be so impressed. You clearly consider Fethullah Gulen as one of the seminal leaders of the past 50 years. Why?
Thank you, Barney, and thank you all for coming out tonight on this beautiful evening, and thank you to Melbourne for the warm welcome that we have received. Did you hear the emphasis on the word warm? The spring welcome, and I want to acknowledge my wife, Lisa, who is here traveling with me. Would you please greet her? So to your question, Barney, why Fethullah Gulen, and why do I see him among the leading religious figures of the late 20th century and the early 21st? I want to start with actually a quote from a woman by the name of Julian of Norwich, who was a 14th century Christian anchorite. And Dame Julian once said, "The way to fight evil isn't to cudgel the brain," or as I translate that for my undergraduates, the way to fight evil isn't to bang your head against the wall. The way to fight evil, she said, is to lead a life of love and laughter. So, as I dug into the research on Fethullah Gulen, I discovered an individual whose life was dedicated to loving God, pleasing God, and to loving our neighbor. And that acquainted him with deep suffering in the world, but also acquainted him with the capacity humans have for deep joy. And in the spirit of Dame Julian of Norwich, and in the spirit of Fethullah Gulen and his commitment to addressing the unnecessary suffering in the world through love, which can also inspire joy and laughter, I hope it's okay, Barney, if before I dig into a detailed response to your question, I try to inspire some laughter among us this evening. So, one of the things I do in my vocation as a pastor, I serve a church in Green Bay, Wisconsin, is I often do youth and children's messages, sermons. And one of the ways to build trust between people is to laugh together. And although my ancestry is German and Norwegian, so I'm half German and half Norwegian, traditions that are not known for their sense of humor, I'm going to try, at least, to engage you in some laughter tonight by telling a few knock-knock jokes. You know how these work? Yes? Okay, good. So please join me then. Here we go. The first one. I have 3 terrible jokes. They're really bad. All right, so knock-knock.
Who's there?
Ach.
Achoo.
Bless you, my friends. Achoo, you get it? Sneeze. I know, it's really awful. All right, the second joke. Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Tank.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Tank, who? Okay. I should have found a way to use teşekkürler, to the Turkish. Thank you. All right, last one. Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Olive.
Olive who?
I love you too. Which takes us to our theme. Seviyor. Love of God and love of neighbor. Throughout the course of his life, Fethullah Gulen has faced obstacles has faced persecution, and yet has consistently and patiently, as a faithful Muslim, practiced love as the undying flame of light that God has revealed to all of humanity when we have eyes to see. So I very much see Fethullah Gulen in the company of all of those devotees of love throughout our history. The prophets, the saints, the historical figures who have risked everything for love of God and love of neighbor. So it was truly an honor for me to be able to undertake this research and to discover ever more deeply the life and influence of an individual committed to love.
One thing to admire the Prophet. Why did you go so far as to write a biography? What motivated you to spend 8 years, I think you took, on this project?
My previous book was about religions and violence. The title of the book is Empire of Sacrifice, The Religious Origins of American Violence. It was a painful book to write. It's difficult to see religions turned from their loving essence into something perverse and destructive. So honestly, I was looking for a happier topic to write about. So I began researching religious peace builders in the 20th century and early 21st century. Basically from Mohandas Gandhi to Lima Bowie, the Liberian Lutheran Nobel Peace Prize winner in 2011. And as I began discovering the lives of these peace builders, I had been acquainted with Mr. Gulen's work first time in 2006. I was invited to an iftar dinner in Philadelphia by the Philadelphia Dialogue Forum. I had no idea who the Dialogue Forum was. I had no idea what I was getting into, but they promised me a free dinner at the Sheraton Hotel, and I thought that sounded like a good idea. But as I became more deeply acquainted with Mr. Gulen's life and work, I discovered that he was one of these peace builders, and that rather than writing the survey, I could focus very narrowly on one individual. That commitment deepened as I became more familiar with his writings, his preaching, and as I made more friends around the world, people who were inspired by Mr. Gulen to his met. So the book grew out of those friendships with support from those friends, through interviews, through a little research fellowship, and developed over the 8 years, patiently, slowly, including traveling to Turkey and studying Turkish, the Güzel ama zor Turkish language, the beautiful but difficult Turkish language. And so the biography emerged as a way to lift up one story of a peace builder contributing to a more just, peaceful world.
One of the themes that's prominent in the book is, forgive my pronunciation, Hoşgörü, or principled pluralism. And I have to say that when I first came across Hizmet in Australia, which was about 2003, I found that very impressive, and I still find it very impressive. Normally people of strong faith are not very much open to other opinions because their opinions are already fully formed. But one of the very attractive things about Hizmet is that they, while strong in their own faith, they do listen and are open to dialogue and to expanding their own horizons and that of others. Miroslav Volf, who's a Yale theologian I greatly admire, has said the same sort of thing about Christianity, that it is entirely consistent with political freedom to believe that you have the truth, that your religion is the sole repository of truth, and yet to grant full freedom and political equality to others. How how important has that been in the growth of Hizmet, do you think?
Hoşgörü is a crucial concept and often badly translated from the Turkish into English. And one of the things that drew me to Mr. Gulen and to Hoca Efendi was precisely this participation in dialogue, which is one of the ways to translate Hoşgörü. And it actually resonates very deeply with my Lutheran background as well. There's a paradox contained in Hoşgörü, in that principled pluralism, that is, knowing who one is and practicing one's faith with integrity, and yet precisely because of that integrity, risking the engagement with others. At the core of Martin Luther's teachings is a similar paradox, actually. In his essay on Christian liberty from 1520, which was one of the crucial documents that led to the Reformation, Luther put it like this. He's speaking about Christians. A Christian is a perfectly free, Lord of all, subject to none. And a Christian is a perfectly dutiful, servant of all, subject to all. So, through God's grace and mercy and compassion, we are free to risk ourselves for one another in service. And we are duty-bound to do so at the same time. In that paradox, I see the practice of Hoşgörü, which Mr. Gulen and people inspired by him put into practice first in Turkey, especially in big dialogue events held in Istanbul at the Renaissance Polat Hotel and places like that, where 1,000 people across differences and unprecedented gatherings in Turkey were brought together for iftar dinners. Those iftar dinners can be dangerous things, as it turns out. And often the phrase Hoşgörü, and that the first one of these in 1995, Fethullah Gulen was the keynote speaker, and his theme was Hoşgörü, which usually gets translated as tolerance. But that's really a weak translation and does not convey the depth of the Turkish term. And I once heard what a better definition, a theological definition of Hoşgörü by Dr. Scott Alexander, a Roman Catholic Muslim scholar from Chicago. And he said, Hoşgörü means, literally it means to see nicely. But he said it means to see another as God sees them. And that means to see another primarily with eyes of mercy and compassion. And it seems to me that principle of Hoşgörü can carry one through many difficulties and struggles if one can maintain those eyes to see another with eyes of mercy and compassion.
Another of the important themes is that of altruism. Now, had you asked me before reading this book, I would have thought that the Christian version of altruism was slightly different from the Muslim version, because all the Muslims outside the movement that I've come across are concerned only with the Ummah. I've never heard, in my 12 years covering religion, I almost never heard Muslims express concern about anybody except other Muslims. Now that may be just my narrowness of perspective. I'm certainly not claiming to judge an entire religion on that basis. However, again, this group of people clearly share the Christian understanding of that everybody is your neighbor is whoever needs you. Is my understanding right? Are you going to correct me now?
No, I won't correct you. I'll nuance and add to what you had to say about Mr. Gulen's understanding of altruism and altruism as it has been practiced in the global Hizmet service movement. I structured the book in 5 parts, 5 chapters. And each of those 5 chapters highlights a different kind of altruism. The meaning of altruism from the Latin alter means to be other-directed. And if we think about being other-directed, not only in relationship with other human beings, we can recognize the genius of Mr. Gulen and Hoca Efendi in 5 different kinds of altruism. So the first is the altruism of learning. To be other-directed towards learning. And one of the ways that this has been manifested, especially among people of Hizmet, is in overcoming the warfare between science and religion. One of the most devastating warfares of the 19th, 20th, and early 21st century. So that dedication to the altruism of learning, that is, being willing to engage fully and without fear in scientific, mathematical learning, while at the same time bringing one's intelligence and reason to the study of Islam and other religions as well. Seems to me a very important global contribution of the Hizmet movement, and not only to Muslims, but also to many Christians, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, and others. Second form of altruism would be the altruism of devotion. The commitment to faithful practice, in this case in Islam, for Mr. Gulen in Islam. That is, the recognition that oneself is not the center of the universe, but in fact, we are all creatures of a creator who calls forth our devotion in practices such as prayer, pilgrimage, zakat, charity, fasting, and other acts of devotion, which are inherently nonviolent and help teach humans to get beyond the simple animal dichotomy of fight versus flight, and in fact train our brains to be other-directed, to be sociable, to seek companionship with other people, and to the natural world, other-directedness as the altruism of devotion. The third is the altruism of empathy. Mr. Gulen is known throughout Turkey, was known throughout Turkey as the crying Hoca. That is, his tears would flow as he preached. And other people at prayer, there we go, on cue. Other people would also cry with him. And at one level you have to ask, okay, what is that all about? Where does this come from? And when he was asked, he said, well, I guess God just made me that way. Modest man. But in fact, that empathetic identification with the suffering of the world leads to tears. But if it only stays there, it can be emotionally manipulative, it can be something that is superficial. But in fact, Mr. Gulen and people of Hizmet take that feeling of deep suffering with the world and engage it. So engaged altruism, engaged empathy, the altruism of empathy is a crucial element of the Hizmet tradition and practice. Fourth, the altruism of principled pluralism. Again, this conviction that one is secure in one's own faith and identity and doesn't need to defend it, but can release it in dialogue with anyone, no matter how different. Putting into practice what Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, in a brilliant book, Granting to Others the Dignity of Difference. And finally, the altruism of social enterprise. That is, moving us beyond socialism or capitalism into a practice of wealth generation and business that organizes capacities and resources in order to solve social problems and to generate what the economist Robert Reich calls a virtuous circle, whereby as resources are generized and mobilized, they then get released into the community in order to help solve more social problems. So those 5 different kinds of altruism seem to me are crucial to the DNA of Hizmet and emerge out of the life of Fethullah Gulen Hoca Effendi.
Thank you, that's very clear. It was put to me by a member of Hizmet some years ago that Hizmet has emerged as a countercultural rival to Wahhabism. And you have also said that Mr. Gulen is in no way a political figure, and I'll ask you more about that later. And yet the influence, if it is to be a countercultural rival to Wahhabism, especially, for example, in the Caucasus, is political. How much is this true, and how much is it intentional?
Oh, that's a big and loaded and important question. So let's understand Wahhabism and similar movements within Islam in their context. I think as a historian, let's always set things in context. And I think we have to be honest about the colonial dynamic that led to the oppression of Muslims. And in that demise of the Ottoman Empire and the security that it provided and the coherence it provided to the Muslim world, we saw in the emergence of Wahhabism and similar movements a backlash over and against, a reaction to colonialism. In contrast, what I see Mr. Gulen in his life and his teachings putting into practice is actually authentic Islam. Right? Not as a contrast to Wahhabism, but as the continuity of authentic Islam going back to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the revelation of God in Quran, and the revelation of God in nature. All right, so linking those two things together in a way that provides a continuity rather than a reaction. Does it provide a contrast or an alternative? Certainly it does to Wahhabism, but it also provides, it seems to me, a way for Wahhabism and Muslims to get beyond the colonialist legacy or the post-colonial reaction, again, into the practice of faithful, authentic Islam.
You absolved Mr. Gulen from the July 2016 coup attempt in Turkey and suggest that the chief beneficiary was the Prime Minister or President, Mr. Erdogan.
President.
Am I right to see parallels here with the rise of the Nazis, especially the coup as contrasted with the Reichstag fire, the consolidation of extra legal powers in one man, and the scapegoating of a convenient group?
That's a very difficult analogy to draw, and it's a fraught analogy. Anytime you are drawing comparisons with Nazi Germany, you have to acknowledge that what took place in the Shoah and the Holocaust was a distinctive, unique, horrific event and needs to be respected as such. So I will leave that analogy aside for now, while recognizing that the repression that has occurred in Turkey, of which the coup is one example, actually has roots that go back well prior to the coup. Again, Mr. Gulen in his life has repeatedly faced persecution and oppression for no reason other than being a Muslim and for no reason other than because he was a public figure to whom others were drawn and who he inspired. So initially in his life, it was the secularist Kemalist left who targeted him, and whenever there was a coup, and Turkey has been very good at coups over the course of its history. Let's just acknowledge that that has been a pattern, a tragic pattern, but there's certainly been repeated often. And whenever there was a coup, Mr. Gulen would get rounded up, would be detained, would have to answer to the authorities in one way or another. Under the current regime, more recently, we see Mr. Gulen being scapegoated by the political Islamists, by the right. And it began again well before the coup event or whatever it was that happened on July 15th, and it will probably take historians decades to actually sort out all of the details of those tragic events in which people lost their lives. But the scapegoating, right, of Mr. Gulen more recently has united or has allowed the president to unite two very disparate factions in contemporary Turkey, to pull together into some kind of a loose coalition, people who ordinarily would not get along at all. The Kemalist left and the political Islamist right, who are ordinarily rivals, bitter rivals, united over and against one. This is how scapegoating classically works, is it allows the resolution of a rivalry of all against all onto the unity of all against one. It's a tragic pattern that's repeated throughout the history of religions, that those people who are most committed to peace are those who are most slandered and liable to be scapegoated. Gandhi was not exactly beloved by the British Raj. Martin Luther King Jr. was not exactly appreciated by the FBI. There are similar patterns throughout the history of religions, and we could track many cases of people who are dedicated to peace, who fall victim to demagogues, to slander, to lies, in order to perpetuate a fragile kind of political power. Mr. Gulen puts it very well. Power resides in truth. Any other foundation for power is going to fall. And so this current wave of scapegoating, which is not only a Turkish phenomenon, unfortunately it's also a pattern in the United States right now. I believe there are some undercurrents and rumblings in Australia as well, in Hungary, in Russia, in Poland, and many other places. There is this backlash of nationalism to globalization. We recognize that globalization has unleashed capacities, travel, trade, communications that are unprecedented. And this makes us aware of the potential rivalry of all against all. And in that situation, nationalism and scapegoating is an easy way for demagogues to briefly prop up their authoritarian power. And it seems to me what has happened in Turkey is a part of this broader global problem of nationalism propped up by fragile religious claims in order to perpetuate strongmen and their weak egos.
I did phrase my question a bit clumsily. I should make clear that it was, I was thinking of the rise of Nazi Germany, not the end. I'm not suggesting that...
Oh, the Reichstag fire, yes.
I'm not suggesting he wants to kill 6 million Hizmet followers. If indeed there are 6 million, I don't know.
No, I'm sorry. You're absolutely right. I extended perhaps a bit.
I have time for just one more question before I throw it open to the audience to have their turn. And this one also might be a little bit provocative.
Okay.
And I would like to know, Mr. Gulen is clearly near the end of his life. His health is extremely frail. In fact, I was among those who went to meet him last year through the good offices of the Intercultural Society, but he was too ill on the day, and we spent the day in the house but could not meet him. Yeah. That was sad for us, but I mean, obviously we're very pleased that he's still going.
Yes.
The question is, what will happen to Hizmet when he's no longer around, when his inspiration is purely that of memory and his written legacy? Has what he's launched now got its own momentum such that it will continue ever stronger?
With your pardon, I'll read the last few pages of the biography. Finding hope in the midst of trouble has been a regular... This is, if you want to follow along, it's on, I'm a professor, it's on page 357. Finding hope in the midst of trouble had been a regular, almost routine part of Fethullah Gulen's biography. And by now, there were islands of peace, as he called them, on every continent. Those peace islands were the schools, dialogue centers, and social enterprises wherever they operated. And those peace islands were countries where new friends could be made and where Muslims could practice their faith without oppression. For if an old man might be tempted during a cold winter in exile to despair of ever again seeing those green spring days, as he had written in a poem penned while in exile, Mr. Gulen wrote, eyes on a very long horizon and tied to no specific nation, and I'm now quoting Hoca Efendi. Our old world will experience an amazing springtime before its demise. This springtime will see the gap between rich and poor narrow. The world's riches will be distributed more justly according to work, capital, and needs. There will be no discrimination based on race, color, language, or worldview, and basic human rights and freedoms will be protected. Individuals will come to the fore, and learning how to realize their potential will ascend on the way to becoming the most elevated human on the wings of love, knowledge, and belief. In this new springtime, when scientific and technological progress has been taken into consideration, people will understand that the current level of science and technology resembles the stage of life when an infant is learning how to crawl. Humanity will organize trips into space as if they were merely traveling to another country. Travelers on the way to God, those devotees of love who have no time for hostility, will carry the inspirations within their spirits to other worlds. Yes, this springtime will rise on the foundations of love, compassion, mercy, dialogue, acceptance of others, mutual respect, justice, and rights. It will be a time in which humanity will discover its real essence. Goodness and kindness, righteousness and virtue will form the basic essence of the world. No matter what happens, the world will come to this path sooner or later. Nobody can prevent this. We pray and beg that the infinitely compassionate one will not let our hopes and expectations come to nothing. End quote. I continue. In a winter of brutal strongmen, such hopes for a glorious spring seemed utopian, no better than a prayer. Yet if there was one thing that Fethullah Gulen really knows how to do, it is to pray. So when he also encouraged people that difficulties increase in accordance with the greatness of the consequent reward, end quote, that too was a prayer. But it was also a maxim that had proven true and tested in Fethullah Gulen's life almost from its beginning. To some, the oppression in Turkey signaled the death of Gulen's dream for a golden generation. And there was surely a death looming. The boy from Korucuk was now a frail old man. And yet Fethullah Gulen's life was never about a short-term horizon to be measured by a brief span of 80 years and 10. He believed in heaven. He believes in resurrection. He believes in justice. These beliefs were not tied only to the next news cycle, the next election cycle, or even to an individual life cycle. His horizon was eternal. And if the moral arc of the universe was long, and it seemed particularly long in the second decade of the 21st century, Gulen and people close to him also shared the belief of many people of faith that the moral arc of the universe did bend toward justice. They also were convinced that it was humanity's duty to help bend the moral arc of the universe in that direction. As Gulen put it often in many publications, power resides in truth. Any power otherwise founded was destined to fail. And so, the end of Fethullah Gulen's earthly life, whenever it would happen, would hardly be the end of Hizmet. Eternal truth could not be contained by an authoritarian's ambitions. Fethullah Gulen had lived for a peace that surpassed understanding, because it was a peace that surpassed the superficial limits of time and space. After all, even a Sufi in exile whirled in a light far more substantial than mere earthly matter, caught up in an energy that was present at the very beginning of creation and that would be there at the end of time. Thank you.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.